Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here today. I am Cynthia Lovely, the founder of Shine, and it's truly an honor to welcome each of you to this important discussion. At Shine, our mission is to support survivors of trafficking and exploitation, building paths to economic independence through education, entrepreneurial endeavors, and professional growth opportunities. I created Shine out of a deep belief in the importance of survivor voices and the incredible value that lived experience brings to shaping solutions. Our work at Shine, if you don't know us, is grounded in a strength based, co creative model where we're not only creating pathways to prosperity, but building them alongside the thrivers that we serve. This way, we are respecting the richness of their diverse backgrounds every step of the way. I'm really excited because today's space is the first time ever that Shine has done a public panel series. And this would not be possible without the Mr. Ballin Foundation. Mr. Ballin has been supporting Shine's ability to provide our community with high level education, pitch track series, and this 3-part panel discussion, which we're so excited about today. As we kick it off, we hope that this safe space will provide a valuable learning opportunity. Our panel of esteemed leaders have been my mentor, my teachers, and my advisors along my journey as an ally in the survivor ownership movement. So, with that, I'd like to introduce today's moderator, Mary Bull, who will be guiding us through the discussion. Mary Bull has her master's in public health and specializes in community assessment, program design, and evaluation. She is she has led program evaluation processes under the STEPS evaluation model. And she is an ally in the anti-trafficking movement, whoop, whoop, like myself, and utilizes her scientific background for research, writing, and debunking the myths about human trafficking. And Mary, I'm just so grateful that you're here with us to be our moderator and that we're in good hands. So thank you for being a part of this vital conversation. And with that, I'm going to pass it to you.
Thank you, Cynthia and Shine, for existing. I'm super excited to be a part of the first ever public health webinar that you guys are hosting. So truly honored as well. We're going to start with some introductions, get into the panel discussion, which I'm so excited about to be having these conversations. And then we'll just have some brief announcements at the end along with a Q&A. So without further ado, I'm going to begin introducing our panelists. First being Miss Mercy Gray. She is the founder and chief matriarch of Trans Palace, where she seeks to unify sex worker rights and anti-trafficking advocacy while building visibility and response for transgender survivors of sexual exploitation. Our next panelist is Callian Winter. He believes nonprofits doing the most important work are often those with the least funding, which I'm sure a lot of us have found. So he innovated a system of using CRM technology to help boost organizational revenue and expand capacity. This led to the newest company, Taking Roots. He has a long history as an entrepreneur and activist with experiences in anti-trafficking work, marketing, and e-course design, and is particularly passionate about creating accessible and equitable employment opportunities for disabled people. And in his free time, he enjoys watercolor painting and coffee dates with his husband. And our final panelist today is Patty Bennett, who is a dedicated leader, award-winning entrepreneur, and international speaker with over 17 years of experience in personal, professional, and leadership development. As the founder of her coaching and consulting firm, Patty integrates life and leadership coaching to create lasting, transformative growth for individuals and teams. She specializes in trauma resilient leadership and brings extensive expertise in the labor trafficking as a consultant, trainer, and member of multiple advisory councils. Patty's work spans state, national, and international levels, where she empowers leaders and organizations to create supportive, resilient environments for trauma survivors. So, with that, a warm welcome to all of our panelists. As we've stated, super excited to have you all here today and dive into these conversations that everyone I'm inviting to have an open heart and open mind about. And I would love to make most of the time that we do have. So I'm going to kick it off, getting right into the questions. Since today's topic is systemic challenges survivors face with building wealth and thriving as leaders, I would love to start by asking Patty, what would you say is your biggest barrier to building wealth?
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm very excited to be here. Thank you for having me. Thank you, everybody, for being here as well. And I'm very excited to speak about this topic. I really think the biggest challenge, based on my experience, both live experience and professional experience in building wealth, is really making up for lost time and the lack of trauma resilient job opportunities. That's what I've seen the most happen. Many workplaces, they don't consider that the unique need that survivors have. You know, things like the gap in the work history, the readiness for certain jobs, criminal records due to what survivors were forced to do, emotional triggers that can happen often due to past experience. A lot of these things are overlooked, and leaders are not well trained to work with survivors in the workplace. And there's this larger picture too, that survivors often deal with barriers that limit their ability to thrive and to develop new skills, to have a sustainable job. There's a lack of financial literacy as well, support, and the worst is the re-exploitation that happens, unfortunately, in the workplace. And this is really why, after working in the anti-trafficking movement and outside of the anti-trafficking movement, and particularly in the anti-trafficking movement since 2015, from what I've seen and the work that I have done, I developed the trauma, what I call trauma resilient leadership, because I really believe, and I've seen it and have applied the model that I created. It's called the SHIFT model, to help leaders really build a positive, a strong workplace that is inclusive to survivors, without survivors having, to be to point out or have to share that they're survivors. Just to be like a unified understanding that there are over 70% of people in the world that have experienced traumatic events. So we don't have to be singled out. We just have to be included in being treated like humans and receive a lot of support, and have healing center approaches in the workplace, practices that support everyone, especially those who have survived complex trauma. And in learning these skills, the leaders learning these skills, not just going to improve the work for survivors, but it's going to improve the team morale, and there will be a higher retention. Therefore, survivors can keep their jobs and build wealth as they continue to grow in their skill and making up for the lost time, because they have that support, they will have that empowerment, and they will have that psychologically safe place to learn the skills and again, to make up for lost time.
I would love to add to that, Patty. I love what you said about making up for lost time. In my case, as a transgender woman who is also a survivor, the generation before me, almost all of us were in the sex trade to survive, right? Even today, 50% of all transgender women have been in the sex trade at some point in our lifetimes for income, even higher with trans people of color. Those numbers are still overrepresentative in other trans populations, such as non-binary and trans men. If you think about that, and as I talk to trans elders who are still alive, most of the trans people before me are all dead, right? And we didn't get jobs in taxable wage incomes. And so my barrier to achieving wealth is that no one has been here before me, right? No one, it's really uncommon to see a trans person in their 60s or 70s. It's even more uncommon to see a trans person in those age ranges who has a thriving taxable wage income. It simply didn't exist, as well as the over 630 pieces of anti-trans legislation barring our presence in government buildings, our ability to be public in public places, as well as like hunting down children in K through 12 education, with proposed legislation like notifying all parents within a school district if a child comes out as transgender.
Yeah, I want to jump in too. Thank you both for what you shared. I think, again, I'm really drawn to Patty's original idea of that like lost time, and also adding on to what Miss Mercy said. As someone who's non-binary, I really relate to a lot of that, as well as just the idea of really considering that lost time that we have, that most people who are not survivors are developing skills, they're developing, they're going through education. They're developing emotional resilience in a way that's seen as, the normal experience of growing up and stuff. A lot of those of us who have survived this sort of extensive trauma, we find that we not only lose the time in the actual like trauma that we're going through. So it's like that actual time, sometimes quite literally through amnesia or things like that too, but also in how we have to recover. Because I also, I'm someone who's also disabled, and I know a lot of other survivors that I know deal with multiple disabilities as a result of their trauma too. So like that's one way of losing that sort of time, is additional doctor's appointments, also just even additional therapy or things like that too. Additional rest time to just regulate our bodies, all of that is also lost time that isn't just in the trauma that we faced, but it's also when we're working a job or when we're starting a business, we end up needing all of this extra time as well. And I'll say, even from my own experience, one of the things I had to do because of my my journey as a survivor was to flee the United States. And I had to leave both for an intersection of trans rights and also for like my trafficking experience, and how my trafficker still had power in basically anywhere that I was in the country. So I had to find out how to leave the country. And that was something that took, 3 years of my time, and that was like basically like having a whole other full-time job, was just trying to navigate that immigration experience, trying to stay out of the country, like doing all those things. And I know that this is just my own experience with that, but I'm certainly not the only survivor who has had to leave their home country or even migrate between multiple different countries just to seek that sort of safety. And I think we're going to see it even more now that there's, like Miss Mercy said, like multiple levels of victimization towards sex workers, especially trans sex workers, and things like that too. And that sort of intersection with, not that sex work is not trafficking inherently, but there's an intersection of the human rights there, and how like so many people are going to be in situations that make them more vulnerable to victimization as a result of these sort of things. And we're just going to see an increase in, fewer and fewer people being able to access like labor rights and taxable wages and things of that sort, as well, that are just additional barriers in that.
100%.
Absolutely. Any other comments we want to mention on that first question? Okay, the second one is pretty much a follow-up of the first, in a way, where we've established these barriers that you guys have laid out for us. And so then I'm curious, how could Shine or other organizations like Shine help to remove those barriers? And I think, Callian, you had some thoughts on this question you'd like to share first.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. And also, I didn't actually say because I was responding to everyone, thank you so much for having me here too. So it's an absolute joy to actually be in this webinar and everything. So thank you all. So yeah, so to your question on how do we kind of start removing these barriers, right? And how do we make employment and self-employment more accessible for survivors? So I'm sure there's like a billion things that we could do, but I'm going to kind of try to highlight two that I think come up really often. And we often see a stark limitation of this. And this is something that I noticed. I was in a working group recently that was evaluating global employment programs for survivors. So these were two of the big things that I noticed. One is that a lot have very gendered barriers. Um, so there's a lot of programs out there that are specifically, geared towards women, and typically only cisgender women, unfortunately, but geared towards women and use very feminine language, which even if the program will allow masculine or non-binary individuals into that program, it can just feel kind of othering or create a barrier or a sense of discomfort for those particular survivors. And so there's often that sort of barrier that I notice. And I think just considering what sort of language we're using and increasing the level of like gender inclusivity in that language is going to make the programs from the outside. So from the website, from the social media, and things like that, when survivors are just looking for what resources are out there for me, it's going to create more accessible, programs like that. I'll also say too, in that kind of front level thing is also just talking about accessibility. A lot of websites aren't screen reader accessible. A lot of videos don't have captions to them. I know I've run into that, and I know, there's been a lot of programs that I wanted to take part in, and they just didn't have captions or they didn't have things like that. And it just made it like, it was like, this is already a difficult subject because it's processing trauma and stuff. And I was like, I can't do this when I'm also straining my ears, and things of that sort as well. So it was really like thinking about those two things from the front end. And then I would say as well from the actual organization and programming side is thinking about flexible scheduling. So I've seen a lot of programs that I would love to take part in, like things that are, deepening coding and technology skills, because that's the sort of thing that I work with, or these sort of like business boot camp kind of things. And they're amazing programs, but they require like basically a 9 to 5 for, 8 weeks or something like that. And unfortunately, the thing is that like, although these programs are great, especially when they're offered at no cost, I feel like a lot of programs need to have multiple setups because a lot of the time, like survivors have barriers, whether that's disability, whether that's being a single parent, whether that's needing to actually keep themselves employed during that time, with a part-time job or something like that, while they're learning a skill to help them advance. So unfortunately, there's just a lot of programs that are just simply not accessible. Like for me personally, I have a very limited amount of hours that I can work every week in order to keep my health all right. And I'm not the only survivor, with those levels of limitation. Also things like time zones and stuff. So thinking about like flexible offerings, things that basically, maybe on-demand programming and then tests and certifications at the end. Like how can we make things that they're more self-paced, yet still allow that level of evaluation and community that we can get through the more traditional like e-learning courses, but there's set time. So thinking about things from that perspective too.
I agree with a significant amount of what you said, Kellyanne, and but I would also want to provide some context. I have sold sex as a male and as a female, and I will say that they are two completely different experiences. And I find as a woman that I need like femme specific spaces. That's not to say that inclusion is not just as necessary. That's not to say that spaces that are totally inclusive of all genders is not necessary. I'm just speaking from my own experience that like the level of disposability I've experienced as a woman is inherently significantly greater than I ever experienced in my worst trafficking experiences as a male. And I think that's one of the wisdom we have in transgender people coming to the table, right? Is that we have this like multiplicity of experiences, I'm able to speak from that, which is so like kind of wild. One of the things I think Shine could do to remove some of those barriers, you have to keep in mind that in like 1974 was the first time women could even own bank accounts without restrictions, right? And so similarly, as we needed support for these kind of financial empowerment, we also need that now. I think in two parts, we need to provide training to employers on transgender inclusion, as well as uniting the sex worker and anti-trafficking movements. At the end of the day, we've all been part of the commercial sex industry. And the opportunities afforded to one should be afforded to all. Oftentimes, there are multiplicities in these experiences where people who identify within the sex worker movement have also been trafficked. And that fit the DOJ's definition of severe forms of trafficking, that's also within the AMP model, the TVPA. As well as providing direct empowerment and mutual aid to survivors by bringing these opportunities directly to diverse survivors for all the reasons that I explained in my previous answer around how we just haven't been around to receive these before. But I really do appreciate your answer and hopefully bring like a healthy level of tension to the conversation.
Yeah. And absolutely no tension, like no worries at all. I actually think, no, that brings up a really important point, which is having specific isolated spaces as well. Not isolated, maybe that's the wrong word, but I don't know. I've like, once I became bilingual, my brain doesn't do language anymore. But these sort of like differentiated spaces. So having spaces that are exclusively for women, having spaces that are exclusively for trans women, having spaces that are exclusively for non-binary people, for disabled people, for blind people, like all of these sort of levels are really important. And I think one of those, like, I think that that's a beautiful point. I think at the same time, also recognizing that at least in this global audit that like this working group that I was in did, and we audited a ton of programs, 90% used women-centric language. And I think that that's something, and we're specific to that. So it's sort of this idea of not excluding the fact that we want these isolated spaces, but rather incorporating the idea of having neutrality as a basis when there's so few programs out there, having that as a basis, and then expanding into these areas of more and more like, these specific niche communities, I guess. Because I think that it's something that, we need to just balance the score a little bit in that. But I'll also say too, like, I would not feel comfortable in like a male only space because I'm not a man, and things like that too. So it's this idea as well of like trying to find that balance, and how also, of course, as inclusive as it can be, we're never going to have a space that's going to fit every person, in that category. And I think it's worth every program manager, every nonprofit founder, to recognize that as well. But no, I love the point that you brought up about having these specific spaces. Same with different language communities, immigrants only, different faith communities, things like that too. Like all of them are very important because sometimes we just need that identity to be a part of our survivor experience and to know that we can safely talk about that. So yeah, no, I love that point. And thank you for bringing it up too.
Thank you. Thank you both. I love to bring up, speak a little bit on the topic that you mentioned about immigrants, and speaking multiple language. Like that's my experience. Originally coming from Brazil, English is my second language, completely different culture. And there's so many barriers continually until this day, um, for immigrants and for leadership to again be inclusive and remove the barriers in the organization of having a toxic environment, an environment that is not cultural sensitive at all. And it's not focused on helping the people, it's more focused on making the money, goal oriented, a culture that's very fast paced, and it doesn't support everybody. It's not too inclusive. Very often, even until this day, I have to ask constantly, like, slow down a little bit. Forever English is going to be my second language, right? I need to translate what you're saying. I need to get context for things you're saying because some words and some concepts doesn't exist in my language. It doesn't exist in my culture. So being inclusive with that it is really important. We have a country that have so many immigrants, and how can we support them in the workplace? And through my work with survivors, I work in economic empowerment, and every year I work with over 500 survivors trying to build their professional development skills to find different jobs. And I can't stress enough the amount of survivors that talk about the cultural, even not just from a different country, but even from different states, right? The cultural sensitivity that it's needed to have in a workplace. And again, the toxic environment, coming from a perspective of uh, being a survivor of labor trafficking, when I started finding jobs outside of my experience, it was incredibly hard to find a place that wasn't um, that wasn't empowering. There was just so much toxic behaviors that was almost nearly exactly the same behaviors and very similar things that was happening in my experience with labor trafficking. It was so extremely challenging to develop skills and to grow and to heal, because especially right in the initial moment of getting out of the situation, it was hard to even separate, what is a healthy work environment and what is toxic. Like, what did I get out of, and what am I in now? It seems very similar. The only difference is that I'm not locked in a house, that I have the freedom to come and go, and I have the freedom to leave the job. But is that what I wanted? No, I wanted to thrive, right? I wanted to build wealth. I wanted to take care of my family, take care of myself. And jobs are very toxic. Work environments are very toxic quite often. And so, how can we remove that barrier, shift our mindset to build resilient workplace, to build places where leaders are focused on people, to empower people. Therefore, the money, the goals will be achieved. Um, I'm so passionate, like I'm getting even so passionate about leadership, really spending more time in training themselves in how to remove the toxic behaviors in the workplace. So not just survivors of human trafficking can thrive, but all survivors, people that are not even aware that they are struggling, they are being traumatized themselves in workplaces, that continues this behavior of overwork, of not taking time to explain to their employees what they want from the employees, what the expectations are of like you shared before about having the flexibility with their time, because we do have life outside of work, right? So a lot of those things come up for me when it comes to removing barriers in the workplace.
Absolutely. I mean, leadership, I think we've all experienced some form or another of maybe leadership not being what it could be to help their employees thrive, or help the organization thrive. And you really notice that difference. And to the point that Callion and Miss Mercy make, I mean, it sounds like you both were describing there's a lack of awareness of like the intentional spaces that need to be present for people with disabilities, for people who are trans and such and so forth. And so even both of you speaking out of what that need is, I think is crucial and super helpful to what you're putting out there. So thank you all for answering that last question there. Our next question, I would like to focus on, so if you were able to thrive within your chosen field, do you feel like it would be sustainable, or do you think it would be difficult to maintain?
Yes, I'm happy to answer that. I'll also answer while simultaneously answering a little bit of that last question too, of something I just thought of. A common experience to trafficking survivors is the experience of being groomed through narcotics. I'm someone who is in recovery, and in my recovery journey, now what? I was trafficked at 14 out of the states of Washington, Oregon, and Nevada. In my trafficking experience, it's been 20 years since that time. There's a lot of unfolding that happens during that time. So the flexibility to experience all the trauma that's coming back in my recovery, the flexibility to experience sobriety, right? And knowing that that's a desired outcome for folks. Like we want more survivors to be able to achieve sobriety. That comes with unintended consequences. Like I have like really severe nightmares every night because for 20 years I was suppressing my REM sleep and my ability to process those things because I needed to get through all of those things and to survive. So that means that like when I wake up, I'm oftentimes very disassociated or jaded for a period of time. And I just need some time to learn how to accommodate and live with those things. as I process what it even means to experience them. You know, in relation more directly to the previous question, you know, my desired field is in innovating legal services for human trafficking survivors and sex workers, right? It's amazing the level of legislation that we've been able to achieve in terms of creating services that serve trafficking survivors. You know, there's things like the DBRA, which is able to remove negative credit marks related to your trafficking experiences. That just came out 2 years ago. There's the T visa created by Ema Matul. There is a need for victims, survivors of trafficking within the legal framework of an investigation and prosecution to have representation. There's child custody cases, oftentimes guardian ad litem cases where a child is removed from the survivor's custody. And oftentimes, as we know, it's true in DV and all the forms of gender-based violence, the legal systems used to exploit and abuse the survivor. And so there's so many different forms where comprehensive legal services outside of a criminal trial is necessary, right? Having access to many of these things myself and providing advocacy over the course of a decade to thousands of survivors, that I'm able to sort of synthesize these needs succinctly. So what does that mean for me in terms of being able to thrive within my chosen field? Well, that means I have to go to law school, right? Law school is very expensive. There's lots of barriers to getting into law school. I happen to find a law school that has more low barriers, and even within those low barriers, I'm not even fully admitted to a JD program now, right? It's like there's like more barriers. I have to be able to like get through this preliminary period, get through a JD program on probation, then maybe do a full-time JD program for the next 4 years, be insanely busy while working full-time because I don't have the privilege of inherited wealth. You know, I don't have that privilege of being able to just take a year or two off to go and go to law school, let alone get like high enough LSAT scores, right? As I talk to professors in the law field, they say things like, well, you know, if you were like a white cisgender person, I would give you totally different advice, but you're a transgender indigenous woman. Just get into any law school and pass the bar, you know? Because you're not even going to be treated the same anyways. The decorum that sort of is expected of an attorney you will be held to, but you will not be given the same privileges and access points. So my ability to thrive within my field, identified field, is quite cumbersome. You know, I have to identify an organization that has sustainable funding for those kinds of services. These are new services, right? The anti-trafficking field is only 22 years old. You know, the inception of the TVPA wasn't that long ago. We tend to forget these things. You know, and with an incumbent potential attorney general for the DOJ being investigated for child sex trafficking, who knows the availability of these continued forms of funding, as well as not being persecuted for being transgender and not being persecuted for wanting to support sex workers as well. Actually want to finish this off and say, like, also my ability to thrive within this field is also based on my identity, not just as a transgender woman, but because, you know, I also largely continue to need contract work to support my life. I need this money to pay for my gender affirming care surgeries and prep for these surgeries, oftentimes that aren't directly covered by insurance, like electrolysis and hair removal for other procedures, such as gender reassignment surgery. And as well as being a Filipina, you know, I have a deep desire to give back to my family who has lived in poverty their whole life. So these are all things that are core to my identity that I need to fulfill before I even begin to think about buying a house or something of that nature.
Yeah, I want to kind of jump in and kind of add to this the barriers of education aspect. So I originally, well, I've done a lot of work in this field over the past like decade, but one of the focuses before I really started the work that I do now was specifically trying to educate trafficking organizations and professionals on like the experiences of dissociation within survivors, as someone who has a dissociative identity disorder, and everything like that, and something that a lot of survivors live with, like 33%, some preliminary studies were saying. So it's like really, really high percentage of survivors live with this. And it's one of the most stigmatized, quote unquote, mental illnesses out there. Much more an adaptive response to trauma, in my opinion, but that's a whole separate topic. But anyways, one of the things that I kept coming across was, despite having over 4 years of intensive, like self-studied research, way more than someone would do in a PhD program, despite having like even more years than that of community advocacy, really getting to know hundreds and hundreds of different, systems or people who live with this condition, and their different unique experiences, and then also doing my own self-advocacy and education within that community. Despite all of that background experience, there was constantly this pressure of like, well, we can't pay you more unless you have a PhD. And I was like, how, as someone who is, like disabled and able to spend, I don't know, 10 to 15 hours a week doing any sort of cognitive labor, how am I supposed to, get a PhD and sustain myself at that same time? Because, I also don't have access to just the ability to pay my way through college or things like that, let alone to also additional barriers to accessing the right kind of program, it would have to be virtual. Like there's all of these things that are just really impossible in a way. And it was very discouraging because I was talking and training, international PhDs on this who were willing to give me, advice. And they were like, you taught me more in a 1-hour session than I learned in my entire program, my entire 10-year program. And they're like, I wish that you were in like every college, that you could teach this. And I got that time and time. And then it was just like, but then I was constantly running up against people who are like, oh, you can't be talking about this because you don't have a PhD. And I'm like, the stuff that PhDs and research is teaching is literally severely harming this community. And it was just such a like uphill battle. And in order to like validate the work that, I was carrying forward the voices of people who were like, please share these experiences, like, that sort of thing. And then my own experiences, in order to validate that, I had to get a PhD, and that just wasn't accessible. So it was something that my initial chosen field was not sustainable. No matter how much I cared about it, it was literally not something that I could do and make a living off of. Despite how, well known I got in that space, it just wasn't that sustainable. So I pivoted and I like where I am now, but I think it is worth recognizing that probably a lot of survivors have these sort of pivots where they run up against some sort of educational barrier or some sort of other barrier in this field and have to be like, well, I want to do this, but this isn't sustainable. So where else do I go? And maybe we end up somewhere that we're even happier, but it's this idea that like oftentimes I think our initial jump into this space often is a lot more challenging and full of barriers than we think.
I agree with the educational piece, for sure. I mean, that was one of the reasons it led to my labor trafficking, because I wanted to get more education to remove barriers in my own country for me to build wealth. And it's not easy to get education anywhere. And so there was an opportunity, right, that if through an exchange students program, that I could get further education here in the US, and that was used against me, right? That was literally the reason, through a fake organization that would bring international students here, was actually brought here to work and not allowed to go to school. So after many years, many years, I already had kids, and I was way older than I was finally able to go to college. But even then, right, now I have to pay for the education while I'm still trying to overcome and survive all the things that went along with the labor trafficking, and that takes like time. Kylan spoke a lot about this. I love what you share. Like it takes so much time for us to take care of our healing. We put so much time and effort and money into that. So in building wealth, we have to take a lot of the money that we make and pour it back into our own lives. It's not easy to find support. Therapy is one of the hardest things to find, believe it or not. It's 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 insane, and insurance covers, but it is not appropriate type of therapy. It takes so much effort. Like I used to joke, but it's not really a joke. It's true. I had to get a second job to pay for my own care, to pay for the diet that I have to do special due to all the chronic illness that I have. I have to pay extra to go to get care that's not covered not covered for by insurance for physical healing that I have to go through. It's not covered. I have to pay out of my pocket. And I can go on with the list. I actually calculated one time to do a speaking event, and it was close to $63,000 that I had to spend a year in my care. That's like a job. That's a what you can make in a year for a certain job. So I have to get a second one because it costs so much to care for me. And then there's the stigma that comes on top of that for people who don't understand the amount of trauma that you had to endure. And instead of like celebrating that, good for you that you're actually taking care of yourself, where there are so many leaders there leading big organizations that are not spending time healing themselves and causing more harm to people, re-traumatizing people. We are here. I mean, most of the survivors really that I talk to, we're all spending so much time, money, and effort in our healing that it becomes a barrier of time and like Kailani already spoke on this, and the money we're making is being invested back in ourselves. So support with that would definitely help us focus on our businesses, on our jobs. Right, I have the opportunity that for me it was a little bit different, where I started first working in different fields, and then I moved into the anti-trafficking movement. So I had the opportunity to see how different the worlds are outside of the anti-trafficking movement when it comes to building wealth. I wouldn't say like one is healthier than the other. They're just different. But the perspective that comes from that is again the empowerment and the levels that leaders that are for profit, they would do anything and everything to make more profit in their company. So they're willing to do the hard things. They're willing to learn how to become, they never heard of trauma informed. There's so many people in this world that do not understand trauma. So that's number one, understanding more about what trauma is and the impact it has on people. But when I was in the for-profit world, people, obviously this is generalized, it's not for everyone, but this is just from my own experience. But people were more willing to learn what they can do to lead well. Whereas this nonprofit, the word I hear the most, which is something I wasn't used to hearing in the for-profit, is we don't have money, 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 we don't have money. Like a song, is like as a theme, it's all over all over the place. Therefore, it makes things very hard to just support the people in their own organization. And here they are trying to support people outside of their organization when it's hard to spend money to train their own people in how to learn about trauma, how to remove toxic behaviors. 100%, as I would say. I know that's a big call, but removing those toxic behaviors by 100%. And really, because we are in the anti-trafficking movement, we understand trauma from experience. So let's invest time and money, just like we survivors are investing time and money in developing more skills to better support the workforce, the workplace. So I'll let y'all speak, because I can go on this. Like, all be more human-centric.
I know there's so many like threads I could pull and like go deeper and dive deeper into like everything everyone is saying. But I know one more question I'd like to get to at least, and so that being is, what would you do with your newfound wealth? And Callie, and I believe you're gonna open that up for us first.
Yeah, for sure. So to give a quick recap, or a quick idea of what I do, the work that I do is I actually help, kind of speaking off of what Patty just said, that whole like, we don't have any money and these barriers of time and everything. I help nonprofits get over that through technology. So that's basically what I do, is a really capacity building using CRM technology that helps generate consistent revenue without using any staff time, prevents burnout, very human-centric model. Allows people to do the important work and technology to do all of the tedious tasks. So one of the things that I am really passionate about is if I was able to like develop, my wealth to the place that I would like it to be, is to be able to take that and reinvest it in the communities that I'm a part of, and also communities that I'm not a part of, intersectional ones and stuff. That and be able to employ people who aren't typically given high paying jobs, especially in technology, and things like that, who probably have identities as survivors, as disabled survivors, as immigrant survivors, things like that. Things that are flexible consultancy-based roles, or contract-based roles, that really allow survivors to set their own schedules. So instead of being like, okay, you're working X many hours and that's your employment, saying, here's the idea, here's the average time I would expect that this would take, but you get a per project payment. If you do it in half the time, take that. And really making sure that there's really equitable pay, that I'm starting at that level of really equitable pay, especially accommodating for the fact that, living with chronic illnesses, allergies, disabilities, living as a trans person, all of those sort of things are really expensive sorts of life. And I think really trying to accommodate for, okay, let's say that on average, someone in this field is getting 30 an hour. Well, I'm going to try to calculate it at 50 an hour, and that's going to be the base rate of what I estimated that project is, and stuff like that. And having that really consistent, predictable workflow and creating that sort of very like independent, skill-based, like empowered work, and being able to really also just help other people learn too, because I'm a big teacher myself. So I would love to like have someone who's like, okay, I'm familiar-ish with this technology. I've dabbled in it, and I think I like understand the processes. Can you just show me the systems? And like, I would love to kind of take that time to really nurture that sort of skill in someone and have them, build that skill. So whether they stay working with my company or whether they move into another one, they would be able to sustain themselves on being able to work like 10 hours a week, and things like that. So yeah, that's kind of my dream of what I would do with that sort of wealth.
I think I would, similar to like how I was saying, like get like my transness and provide mutual aid and solidarity economies for my community. In the realm of myself, I would get all the surgeries I need to feel like myself. I personally don't like being a fetishized object, and that's sort of like what trans women oftentimes experience and where we experience trans violence. Like I would just like to feel like my body matches my identity, and not be objectified constantly in that way. I would also, like call me traditional, but like would love for my parents like not have to worry about a mortgage. My dad was a 25-year Navy chief. He is like very, very disabled, 100% totally and permanently disabled by Veterans Affairs, and he has to still work to make his mortgage, and he has like no cartilage between his knees, he's in constant pain. And I just hope that I could support them and just retiring because he served our country like long, and provide a cooperative housing model for other trans people. Because if we're the land owners, if we're the building owners, we can kind of eliminate a lot of the barriers of experiencing criminalization, as well as a physician to the
I, as of now, after all this experience I have had, I'm very invested in using any wealth to invest in building systems that support that trauma resilient, trauma informed leadership. I really think that this model that I created, that I've been working on, I've already tested with different organizations and even a very large tech for-profit company. And I really think he will make a really humongous impact in the workforce, and most importantly for fellow survivors to not just get a job, but keep their job and build their own wealth, because they will be in places that will be supporting them to continue to increase their resilience and build new skills, and they won't have to leave jobs because it doesn't support them. It's toxic, and all the things we already talked about today. So investing in this system to grow, to be able to be in the hands of every organization is my vision. That all the workplaces can really go deeper in their learning and what it means to truly be, compassionate, understanding, and equipped to take those practical actions in the workplace that supports all people, including survivors. I will really prioritize initiatives that would drive real economic empowerment, really building professional skills for survivor, encouraging self-confidence without singling them out, just focusing on that inclusivity of all survivors.
Yeah, if I can jump in real quick too and say, because I know that I was talking from the framework of within the business to start in this question, but also I love what you said, Patty, and that reminded me of one of my other big goals about really focusing on that systemic change, because that's like the core of what I do, is really thinking about how do organizations that don't have access and are often denied access to the funding that's needed for like multi-year staff grants and stuff, how do they expand capacity, expand revenue generation, especially donor-centric revenue in that, and using this technology system that I've developed to do that. And making it really customized. So one of the things that I would love to do, hopefully someday when my company is big enough, is to be able to basically every year pick an organization and build this system for them completely pro bono. So especially focusing on community-led, probably global South, and multiply, marginalized organizations and things of that sort that are just not going to be able to even get a grant to like host this original type of work. So being able to really, expand that sort of program in this way, or just train others to do it as well, and basically just helping more and more grassroots and community-led organizations do that. So yeah, really allowing that system to kind of just expand and building that capacity, and then seeing that organization, instead of helping 10 people a year, they can help 100 people a year, and that just has such a ripple effect. So that's always how I kind of view that sort of thing. And yeah, hopefully someday we'll all be rich, and not rich, but like rich enough to do these dreams. So like not the bad rich, the giving rich.
Good wealth, yes.
Yes, the generous.
I was saying, hope everyone's, yeah. I know, I hope everyone's dreams come true here, that they're able to expand upon, their vision and build upon that. That's massive. And I want to open up for last two questions. You can answer either or, really. Either, is there anything you'd like to share that we haven't touched upon yet? This would be the time and space to do that now. And in addition to, if you feel like answering this one as well, is there anything that your entrepreneurial endeavors need support with? So either those questions, one or either, we would love to hear your mind on those.
I think we need scholarships. Like all of us have talked about education. So that's a quick, simple answer to that one. But the other thing I really miss is Girl Empower Mentoring Services. GEMS used to have a yearly conference. And that was such a beautiful, amazing space I desperately miss, and I think many of us need, where we had hundreds of survivors come together It was all workshops taught by survivors. It's an in-person event, and those relationships are relationships I maintain to this day. It was my entrance into the movement. It's the place where I found my power and voice. I remember my first economic empowerment workshop. I was used to be so triggered by money that I ran out of that workshop crying. I like tried to leave, and I like the double doors didn't open. I sort of like made this really loud noise. It was really funny in retrospect. And I had another friend who chased me out of that workshop, tackled me in the hallway, and just held me. And I was like screaming and like acting really wild, but like she totally understood why, right? Like the idea of autonomy around these things that are really triggering to people who've experienced these experiences. Um, it demanded that kind of response and attention, and it really normalized what it means for us to just go through the world and to survive.
I love that. I love that. And I will just say one sentence to answer this question about if anything else we like to add, and then later we can come back about our entrepreneurial needs. But just to piggyback on what you said, I really think that leadership and wealth really isn't just about individual success. It's about building a community that sustains and supports each other. The there's so many studies that speaks about how much people are alone in the world today. So I really think that spending more time and effort on developing this sense of connection and community will allow survivors and all humans to thrive together.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more about the importance of community. I just had the opportunity to go to my first ever in-person conference, and it was the only one that I was ever able to access with my health and everything. And it was an amazing experience and everything like that. So I would also agree having more spaces like that. I would also say more virtual spaces or hybrid spaces too, because increasing that level of disability inclusivity would be great too, and international inclusivity. One other thing that I just want to add before we kind of jump into our wrap up about what we really need in the Q&A and stuff, is one thought that I had earlier was just being attentive to, especially in like business coaching and business entrepreneurship, to cultural differences, not just around how money is treated, but also how money can be gained. So like in my faith community, like things are involving interest rates like aren't permissible. So basically, business loans, credit cards, those sort of things are just not an option. And I think it's really important too that, business coaches, or also just, even people who are looking at educational opportunities and stuff like that are sensitive to those kind of cultural barriers that can happen in certain, communities and faith identities and cultural identities and things like that too. So I think just, having that sort of awareness of those kind of differences. And if someone brings that up, like being really open and creating a safe space for like, oh, why is that? How can we work around this? And basically thinking that not always the like traditional path towards entrepreneurship or business ownership, that may not be, an accessible path for everyone, and it may not be the desired path for everyone. So if we're in a space of leadership, thinking about what multiple paths can we offer and what other ways can we kind of innovate around people's unique experiences.
Yeah, at the end of the day, everyone's going to be having their own journey, and it's going to look different on everybody. So that's a great last point to make for sure.
Yeah.
As far as it goes to for, oh, go ahead. Were you going to say anything else? Sorry.
Oh, no, it's fine. I just wasn't sure if you wanted me to jump into us real quick talking about our entrepreneurial desires and stuff like that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
So
you're right on cue. Go for it. Yeah.
All right. Perfect. I was going to say, I was like, well, I was just talking, so I could jump in. Yeah. So personally, I would love any connections with nonprofit organizations, whether that's you're in a nonprofit or ones that would be amazing for building those connections, both for that nonprofit to build capacity, but also to help sustain my own business. Or if you're in a position where you're a funder of a project like that. So if you have, $2,000 to $3,000 that you can grant to an organization to help them generate long-term revenue for decades, then let's talk. So that would be amazing. like that sort of thing. And also speaking opportunities at virtual conferences would be lovely in my experience, just to be able to share this sort of capacity growth, because it's a really new concept about how to use technology in this way. So I'd love to get that out there. So those are my personal 3 asks from the audience, I guess.
Awesome. I can go next. For me, partnering with nonprofits that want to implement that trauma resilient leadership model that I have created, some support for that. It would be, I already have a manuscript for a book that that I wrote that has all about trauma resilient leadership and the model, and stories that with all the organizations and different companies that I worked with, applying this model. So I need support in the publishing arena, especially when it comes to retaining my intellectual property. That this has been very challenging, because when people want to support, they also want a piece of it. They want to keep my intellectual property. So it's been challenging to find support with that. You know, the self-publishing or publishing, any of those arenas help with that. Editing and proofreading will be a big support as well. The marketing, all the things that are involved when you are publishing a book like this. And lastly, I do have a survey that I used, although I interview a lot of people to develop this this framework. I'm still collecting more research and analysis to before I publish the book. So it would be really helpful, anybody that's interested to have, you know, an extra 10 minutes to complete the survey. I'm not at a college that provides financial support for those types of surveys. So it's just me as a solopreneur. So if anybody is interested in doing that, that would be extremely helpful. So I can you know, launch this book next year and help different organizations better work with survivors of trauma.
For me, it's be doing the same work I did when I was a male. You know, I have served under orders signed by executive order by the president. I have worked on almost every division of government as a male, but then when I transitioned, it's like all that just stopped, right? And so like if I could just do that now, that would be great. You know, when we look at our promising practices and best models for responding to trafficking, we're lucky if we have one identified transgender person. You know, and as I speak with people who lead all anti-trafficking efforts, investigations, and prosecutions for our nation, the tip top, right? They explicitly state that the reason is for law enforcement bias, bias within our first response systems. And I'm someone who's pro law enforcement, a very moderate approach, right? It's not to say that we should defund all these things or anything like that, but to say that we should demand that like that's not optional for a public servant to turn away a child based on their identity because they're being commercially sexually exploited. And I would really love to be at tables that increase identification and response for all populations for the outcome-oriented goal of responding to trafficking in every gender and sexuality. Because it's just simply unacceptable that someone could assert their political beliefs in that way when a child is being sexually exploited, let alone an adult as well. But my specific arena is really focusing on minors.
Fantastic. Those are all the questions I have planned, or that Shine has planned. But I'd love to open up the Q&A for any questions that have come in, and we can just spend the next 5 minutes or so going over any questions that have come in. I see one right now that's asking, what's the end goal of the meeting today? Not saying this in a negative way, but I would just love to know what the action plan is for this once the meeting is over. Is it a networking event or informative event? So I can kind of see this being a question maybe towards Shine more specifically than maybe the panelists, unless panelists, you have something to have to add to this answer. I can just speak from my end. I feel like it's kind of a networking and informative event in a way, because we're here to, platform our panelists, and not only that, but see who has shown up to the webinar as attendees and make new connections that way. But also, I think the information that was provided today is extremely valuable and needs to be echoed out to generations and generations on. So I don't know if Cynthia or anyone else has anything they wanted to add about the goal of the meeting today, or if anyone has any general perspective of what they think the end goal of this meeting is. I'd welcome you to share that now too.
Sure. Hi, everyone. This has been so incredibly informative, and I think it is that yes and, and I really love how Callion positioned it as a member of team or Team Shine, I should say, that, we are setting this up for the next two pieces in this series to really lay the foundation for what the systemic barriers are. And then we're going to be moving into the entrepreneurial aspirations and the resourcing of our thrivers as entrepreneurs, and then ultimately leading to, how are we building wealth within this community, and what, the public can do to better understand these stigmas that our business owners face. And we just covered such great ground today. And I just invite anyone who does have lived experience and wants to be a part of this community to visit shinesd.org and fill out our application. We are a growing community of thrivers that do lead in different arenas. Not everybody has a business, but everybody is here to pursue their personal passion. And we welcome all people to this space.